Welcome to Excel Basics video number 20. Hey, in this video, we got to see the power of pivot tables. Now, we've already had 4 videos where we talked about pivot tables earlier in the class, but in this video, we want to see 14 amazing pivot table reporting tricks from slicers to the amazing show values as. Now, this is video 32 in the Office 2016 series. And of course, if you want to download this file or the 22 pages of PDF notes, you can click on the link below the video. Here's our 14 examples, and we're going to see examples like calculating average revenue by product category and country, connecting it to a slicer which will filter the entire pivot table report, and then we'll connect the slicer to more than one pivot table. We'll see how to group revenue by year and month, and then we'll see the amazing show values as calculation to calculate things like change for each month, percentage change, running total. We'll even have 2 text data sets, one where we have phone purchase data, and we need to count how many of each phone was purchased and calculate the percentage purchased for each phone. Then we have a CPA data set where we're going to calculate the percentage that fail or pass, and we'll cross-tabulate those percentages to figure out whether or not taking a CPA prep course really helps. Now, we've had 4 videos already in this class, so I want to go look at each one of the videos. I'm going to click on Video 4 Sheet just to remind us of where we've come from in this class with pivot tables. Now, in Video 4, we just had a small data set, and we compared and contrast sum ifs and pivot tables. We saw clearly that pivot tables are an easy and great way to make a calculation with a condition or criteria. In video number 5, we saw that we can have different aggregate calculations like count, sum, and average. We also, very importantly, saw that it's easy to create a cross-tabulated report and add a slicer with a pivot table. Also, the PDF notes for video 4 and 5 are epic notes for everything about the basics of pivot tables. In video 13, we saw how to use the if function to add a helper column, which in essence added a new category for our data set. And then we were allowed to use the entire data set, including the extra column, to build a pivot table. And in video 15, we saw how to use the Excel table feature with dynamic ranges so we can add new data and create a pivot table from it. Now, let's go to the sheet data analysis just to remind ourselves. We've talked about this many times. Data analysis, or also in the business world called business intelligence. What's the definition? We're going from raw data, and we're going to convert it into useful information. What do we need in order to create a pivot table? Well, we need a proper data set. And as we've talked about many times in the class, that means field names in the first row, records and rows, and empty cells all the way around. Now, let's go look at our first example. I'm going to scroll over, and we're going to click on the sales data sheet. Now, here's our data set we're going to build our first couple of pivot tables from: date, product, country code, units, revenue, and cost of goods sold. Now, we actually already had a data set similar to this, and we used country code in the rows area of a pivot table. The problem with that is it's hard to know from the abbreviation which country is which. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to add an extra helper column. We're going to look up the country code, and here's our lookup table. Country code in the first column, country in the second column. Once we use VLOOKUP and copy it down, it'll be much easier to read our report when we have the proper country name. Then we'll create a second column where we look up product price in this product table and return the product category. All right, I'm going to click in cell G4. equals VL tab. I'm going to use my arrow key to arrow over to get country code, comma. The table, I'm going to click in the top two cells, use my keyboard, Control Shift down arrow F4 to lock it. Now I got to type a comma. Column index, 1, 2. The second column has the country, so I type a 2, comma. We're using exact match because we're looking up exactly that text. So I either put false or 0. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Now I'm going to Control down arrow to go down to the bottom. Wow, look at that, 73,000 rows down, F2. There, I'm just verifying the cell references. Escape, I'm going to use Control Home to jump back to cell A1. Now we click in H2 equals VL tab, left arrow to get the product, comma. The table, I'm going to highlight and hit the F4 key, comma. I'm counting on my fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Product category is in the fourth column, 4, comma, 0 for exact match. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Control down arrow and F2. Just verifying the cell references. Escape, Control Home. Now we have date, product, country code, units, revenue, cost of goods sold, country, and product category. Now we're actually going to use these two fields along with revenue for our first pivot table. Now I'm going to click in a single cell, and our pivot table is going to go on a sheet that already exists called PT1. So I'm going to click in a single cell, insert pivot table, or use the keyboard Alt and V. Now, it got the data set right. I want to click on an existing sheet. And when I select that dialog button, I'm allowed to go down and click on PT1. You can already see the sheet reference there. Now I'm going to select A7. There it is, A7. Click OK. And here's our field list. And look at that. There's our country and product category. Those are the two columns we created with VLOOKUP. Now I'm going to drag country down to rows. And as always, when you drag a field down to rows, instantly in the pivot table, we get a unique list, one of each item from that column. Now I'm going to come over to product category, and for the time being, I'm going to drag it to the columns area in the task pane. Instantly, for the columns, I get a unique list of items from that column. Now I'm going to drag this over here. I want to now drag revenue down to values. And in the values area, instantly I get a calculation with two conditions or criteria. And the conditions or criteria for that calculation, 22,364.97, is beginner category and Bahamas country. Now, column labels and row labels are not good labels in a report. Design, over to layout, report layout, show in tabular. I'm immediately going to click in the values area, right click, not format cells, number formatting, because we want to add number formatting to the actual field, not the cells. I'm going to select currency. And for this report, I'm not going to show a $ because it will be very cluttered with so many numbers. And I'm going to, since this is a high-level report, display 0 decimals. Click OK. Now I'm going to drag this over to the side. Now, this report is nice. Any intersecting cell I can clearly see at the top of the column. There's the criteria freestyle. And at the head of the row, there's the country Colombia. But really, I would like a more concise report where I see for each country a vertical list of the product category. So instead of having product category in columns, I'm going to click and drag. And this is why they call it a pivot table, because I can drag it below country. And instantly, I have pivoted my report. And that's what I'm after. The country and then each one of the product categories and the sum of revenue total. Now I want to come up to the top here, hit F2 to put it in edit mode and put my cursor at the end. Then I'm going to indicate the unit, space, open parentheses, $, close parentheses, enter. I'm going to come up and change the column width. Now, it's very common in reports to indicate the unit at the top because then we don't have to clutter up the inside of our report with the unit. Now, sum of revenue is great, but we don't really want sum of revenue. We have in a pivot table 11 different aggregate functions that we can use to make calculations. And there's a list in the PDF notes. There's actually a list right over here on this sheet, summarize values also. Now I'm going to right-click in the values area, go down to summarize values by. That's where we change the function. And in a pivot table, when you right-click, there are 2 different locations to change the calculation. Summarize values by, that has aggregate functions, and all 11 of them are available in more options. And then as we'll see in pivot tables coming up later in this video, show values as with a bunch of amazing calculations. All right, so we're going to try it. Summarize values by and average. Now look at that. It even changed it, average of revenue, and it kept our $ that we created there. Now the next thing I want to do is look at pivot table styles. Now, lots of the times I just keep the default because a lot of these styles up here don't look very good. But I'm going to click the More button for styles, and you can preview. Look, that one there, that one's ridiculous. How about this one right there? Oh, that's terrible. Now, there's a few of them that look okay. I want to select in the first row up here. If you look over to the side, the white font and blue background, the value difference isn't big enough. Same with this one right here. But the second row right here, I like that. The green with the black font color in particular looks good. So I'm going to select this one right here, light green, pivot style, medium 14. Actually, I just learned about this cool style. Someone in the class the other day, Risa, said she liked this one, so we're going to use that one right there. Now, the last thing we want to do to this is we want to name our pivot table. Now, we've learned how to name Excel tables in an earlier video, but we want to name our pivot table because we're going to have multiple pivot tables, and we're going to want to connect them to a slicer. So I'm going to up in Pivot Table Tools, Analyze, go over to the Pivot Table Tools, and there it is. You can click up in the pivot table name, and I'm going to type something like country report and enter. Now later we'll see that that name will come in handy. Now for this particular pivot table sheet, we're actually going to create a second pivot table, add a slicer, and then connect both pivot tables to the slicer. But before we do that, we're going to go start our second pivot table report on the sheet PT2. Now there's nothing here yet, and we're going to start over on sales data. We're going to click in a single cell. We're going to use our keyboard Alt-N-V. It got the data set correct because we have a proper data set with empty cells all the way around. I'm going to click Existing, click on PT2, and click in cell A9. There I see A9. I click OK. Now we're going to see something amazing here. That is the date field. And I want to go back over to the sales data and notice this data set, as well as most data sets that we get that contain transactions from sales. Those transactions are almost always encoded with a date, sometimes with a date and time. But notice, dates are fine. In fact, we might want a daily sales report, but oftentimes we want month, quarter, and year. So remember, those are individual days. If we go back over to PT2 and watch this, that whole date column is filled with days, but in Excel 2016, when you drag date down to rows, it will automatically group by year, quarters, and date. Now, what this means is that when we drag revenue, in fact, let's drag revenue down here. We are allowed from those individual dates to now add by year, quarter, and date. Now, we don't want quarters for this report, so I'm simply going to click and drag it off. Now we're left with years and date. Date is really going to be our month. Now I'm going to come over, and in the row area, I want to right-click and point to expand or collapse. And then I want to expand entire field. That way I can see the year and the months, the year and the months. That's absolutely beautiful. Now, one thing before we move forward. Sometimes you actually want the individual days. You can actually right-click and point to ungroup. That's if you actually want the unique list of days in the rows area and then sum up by day. But we're not going to use ungroup right now. So I'm not going to click that. Escape. Row labels is not good. So I'm going to go up to Pivot Table Tools, Design, Layout, Report Layout, Show in Tabular, or Outline. Both of those will show the field names. So I'm going to click that. Then I'm going to right-click Number Formatting, Currency, 0 decimals, and no $sign. Click OK. Click in the top, F2, space, open parentheses, $signs, close parentheses, and enter. Increase the column width. With the cell selected, I'm going to go up to the More button and click light green pivot style medium 14. Now, we'll come back to this pivot table and add some extra columns and see some amazing show values as calculations. But I had to come and create this pivot table first because I actually wanted to make sure that we grouped so that we had this new field years, because I want to go over to Pivot Table 1, drag this to the side, and with a cell in our pivot table on this sheet, I want to add a slicer. Now, a slicer will be a list of the years over here. And I'm allowed to click on the year, and it will instantly add that condition or criteria to the entire pivot table report. Now we're going to go over to Pivot Table Tools, Analyze, and in the Filter group, we're going to insert a slicer. Now when you insert a slicer, you can pick whichever field you want from your data set. I'm going to check years. And it will add a list of all the unique items from that particular field. Click OK. Now, we'll fix this up in just a moment. But what a slicer does is right now, all the years are selected. That means every cell in the pivot table is for all the years. Now, when I click on 2016, that means every cell in this pivot table is for only the year 2016. Now, when you use either a filter right here, and we saw this back in video number 5, or a slicer, filter or slicer, every single cell in the pivot table gets that condition or criteria. Now, if we compare and contrast rows or columns, that means that for each cell, as we're moving down, the criteria and conditions are changing. In that cell right there, that has 3 conditions or criteria. It's for the product category Freestyle, for the country Algeria, and the year 2016. When I go down to the next cell, the conditions changed. Well, at least product category did. This is the average revenue for the product category Intermediate in the country Algeria in the year 2016. Now when I come down here, 2016 still applies, but now the category is beginner and the country is Argentina. So slicers, they affect every single calculation in the pivot table. Now we need to click on this. We need to get rid of these ghosts here. So I'm going to right-click and point to Slicer Settings. And over in Slicer Settings, here it is, Hide Items with No Data. I'm going to check that and click OK. They're gone. Now I can resize this, drag it to the side, Up in Slicer Tools Options, if I want, I can add a consistent color. I'm going to add Slicer Style. Now, we want to add a pivot table right off to the side in F7, but we're going to start it off by going back to Sales Data. Click in a single cell, Alt-N-V, Existing Worksheet, Pivot Table 1. And I'm very carefully going to try and click in F7. Click OK. Now here we want to drag product down to rows, revenue down to values. Get rid of row labels, design, layout, report layout, show in tabular. Right click, number formatting, currency, 0 decimals, no dollar sign, click OK. Click in sum of revenue, F2 space, and I'm going to add the unit, enter. Increase the column width. Go up to pivot table style, select that consistent style. Now we're going to learn a great trick. We have sum here, and over here we have average. Now we're totally allowed to have multiple calculations on the same field in the same pivot table. So in pivot table fields, I'm going to drag revenue down to values for a second time. I'm dragging it below sum of revenue. And there we go. Now I can come over, right click, summarize values by, and we're going to change it to average revenue for each product. So when I click average, there's the calculation. Now I want to display these with the same number formatting I did over here and is over here. Right click, number formatting, currency, 0 decimals, no dollar sign. Click OK. Click in the top cell, F2 space, parentheses, dollar sign, space, enter. Now I'm going to drag this so we can increase the column width. Now notice every time we drag a number field to the pivot table values area, it defaults to sum. Now let's try, because we want to count how many transactions we had for Alpine and Aspen and Bellin for each one of the products. Because we want to count, I absolutely could drag revenue down there and then right click and change it to count. But if you drag a text field down to the values area, let's do it. I'm dragging product down to values. It will default to count of. And we can see there it says count of product. It's counting how many transactions in the data set were for the product Alpine. Now I'm going to right-click the top cell, number formatting. I'm not choosing currency because this isn't currency. We're counting. I'm going to include 0 decimals and use a comma separator. Click OK. Now, the number formatting looks the same here, but that dollar sign means these are dollars. These are just counting. The word count means integers. We're counting 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now, let's come over. This is exciting. I'm going to use my slicer. Oh, but look at that. When I click on the slicer, it's only affecting this pivot table. Now, before we connect this, let's come back to this pivot table. And we want to come up to Pivot Table Tools, Analyze, over to Pivot Table Tools, click in the name box. And we're going to name this Product Report and Enter. Now we can click on the slicer. And we want to connect both pivot tables to this slicer. So I can right-click, Report Connections. And there's our list of pivot tables. We already see we made a mistake on that other pivot table on Pivot Table 2 sheet. We forgot to name it. But the reason we name it is because many times you have lots of pivot tables in one workbook. So we got to name them to know which ones to check. All right, so we're going to connect Country Report and Product Report to this slicer and click OK. Now check this out. When I click 17, 16, instantly both pivot tables are updating. That is amazing. Now, we're finished with this sheet and this double pivot table and slicer report. Now I want to go back over to PT2. All right, the first thing we want to do here is click in a single cell, Pivot Table Tools, Analyze, over to Pivot Table Tools. Click in the name box, and we're going to call this Monthly Report and Enter. Now we have sum of revenue for each month and for each year. I want to add some extra columns and calculate the difference between. So the difference between each one of these would be February minus January. And so the difference needs to be down by 7,000. Then we need to calculate the percentage difference and then format it as a percentage. Then we need to calculate the running total, which the running total always gives us as we move from month to month, the total for the entire year so far. So those would be examples of the calculations we need to do. Now, instead of doing formulas, and I'll actually drag these off to the side just so we can see that, in fact, the pivot table calculations will calculate this correctly. By the way, if you try to do this yourself, you might not see cell references. You might see get pivot data function, and I have those turned off. So you would have to go to File, Options, over in Formulas, and I uncheck Get Pivot Data Functions for Pivot Table References. You can keep those on if you want. There's some good uses for them, but I have it turned off for this video. All right, let's click back in our pivot table. And we're going to do the same thing. We need multiple calculations on the same field. So I drag revenue down to values. Come over, and we're going to right-click down, not to summarize values by, but this is the first time we're going to see show values as. Now, percentage of grand total would calculate the percentage of every number, like in a cross-tabulated report, compared to the grand total. We'll see percentage of column total and row total in later reports in this video, but they just calculate the percentage of each item of the column and of the row. We'll also see difference from. That calculates the difference from period to period or from category to category. Percentage difference from, and we'll even see running total. Now we want, as our first calculation, difference from. So I'm going to select that. And it says base field date. I'm going to click cancel because I don't like that. I'm going to come right over here. This is a pivot table. And we have our report layout tabular, so properly it shows the date field name. And we can see that checked up here. But we're totally allowed in our pivot table report to type a new name. I like month. Not only is it going to be more informative for our report, but enter. It'll also help us understand what's going on when we use show values as. Right-click in the values area for the second column. Show values as, difference from. And now the base field is going to be month. That means we need to calculate the difference between each month and the base item. Now, sometimes, like in some accounting reports, we want to base everything off of January. That means as the formula copies down, it will calculate the difference from each one of these items compared to January. But that's not what we want. We want to select previous. That way, as we copy it down, it'll take April compared to March, then May compared to April. All right, I'm going to click OK. And that is amazing. It totally is calculating the actual amount of the change or the amount of the difference as we copy down. Now, right-click, number formatting. I'm going to select the same number formatting to be consistent. Currency 0, no symbol. Click OK. I'm going to come up, and I'm going to create a new label here. Change from previous month. Control Enter. Now I'm going to increase the width a little bit and go to Home, Alignment, Wrap Text. Now let's click inside the pivot table, and guess what? We're going to drag revenue down a third time. I'm going to try and move this pivot table field list. By the way, you can change the dimensions of the field list. It's kind of hard. You have to really point carefully. There it is, sum of revenue. Right click, show values as, and we want percent difference from. Same thing, from month, that's our base field. Base item, always look at the previous. Click OK. Oh, it actually calculated the percentage change and added number formatting. By the way, we can see over here that our calculations by formula or by pivot table are the same. Now we're going to drag revenue a fourth time. Drag the pivot table fields off to the side. Right click, show values as, and down to running total. Base field is month. What that means is it will calculate the running total for this year. But then when it gets to the next set of repeating criteria, it'll calculate a new total. If I selected year, it would actually calculate a running total for all 3 years, which means the running total will keep going until it got to the very grand total. But that's not what we want. We want month. When I click OK, that's totally amazing. And we can see over here we got exactly the same numbers. It's totally adding as we go along. And of course, December equals exactly the grand total for the year. And when we look down here, it starts over. And when it gets to December, that's the yearly total, as we can see right here. Right click, number formatting. I'm going to be consistent. Currency 0 and none. Click OK. Now I'm going to change the labels here. Percent change tab. Running total in parentheses the unit. Control Enter and do some wrap text. Now that is pretty amazing. We did not have to create a bunch of formulas, but we're totally allowed first off to group by year and month. That would be quite hard to do with formulas. You have to use SUMIFs with an upper and lower limit for each month. But in a pivot table, we just drag and drop the date, and it does that automatically. Then we did change from previous month, the percentage change and running total. All right, now we have 2 more amazing pivot tables to create. I want to go over to the cell phone data sheet. And look at our data set. It's a single column. These are phones purchased. So it just lists the actual name of the phone purchased. Now, this is very common where you have a single column, where you could have automobiles purchased last month, a particular set of survey responses to a question. But you have a single column, and all we want to do is count how many of each are listed and figure out the percentage of each particular item. Anytime that's the case, we can do a quick pivot table. Now I'm going to click in a single cell and use the keyboard Alt-N-V. I'm going to put this pivot table on the existing sheet. I'm going to put it in C6. Click OK. Now here is our field list. And look, there's just one field. But here's how easy it is. You drag the single field down to rows, and instantly we get a unique list. Then you drag field down to values. And because it's a text field, it defaults to counting. And instantly we have our count for each one of the phones. Then we can drag the text field down a second time, come over, right click, show values as, and we're going to use percent of column total. Now what does that mean? That simply means, well, there's a column total, 559 items purchased. It'll take each one of the numbers and divide it by 559. So when I do show values as percent of column total, instantly it not only calculates the percentage, but it adds number formatting for us. Now, of course, 100% at the bottom, because 559 divided by 559 is 1. And then formatted as percent, we see 100%. But look at that. Each one of these items is expressed as a percentage. We can see Samsung Galaxy S8 was the most, iPhone second most. Now, sometimes this is called a frequency table or a percent frequency report. This is the frequency. This is the percent frequency. And here's the deal. It's so common. You have a single column in business of whatever the attribute is. You've got your unique list. and our percentages. Now, in our case, we did a sample of 559, but if next month we're projecting 10,000 sales, we can take each one of these percentages, multiply it by that 10,000, and that would give us a good estimate for how many of each phones we expect to sell. All right, so this is a very common situation, a single column of text data, unique list, count, and percentages. Pivot tables are the way to do this. Now let's go look at our next example. I'm going to click on CPA data. Now here we have scores from a CPA test. We have a column that tells us whether they took a preparatory course or not. Now this is the same column. It just has a longer label. And this column says whether they passed or failed. Now if I control down arrow, this is like 10,000 records. Control home. Now what I want is I want the prep, whether or not they took prep course in the rows, pass or fail in the columns, and then calculate the percent. So I click in a single cell, Alt and V. I'm going to put this on an existing sheet. Try to click in F6, click OK. Now, I'm going to use the long label CPA prep course, drag it down to rows. There's our unique list. Now I'm going to drag pass or fail down to columns. Now we have a cross tab. I'm going to drag test, pass, fail down to values. That gives us the count. You can see we had exactly 10,000 records. Now we need to express for the row. This is, they did not take a prep course. They took a prep course. I need to compare each one of those numbers, 5,175 and 1,000, and divide it over 6,175. Do the same for took a prep course and the same for every person in that data set. Right click, show values as, and percent of row total. Just like that, with a few clicks, we have our answer. Of the people, well, actually, our first answer is that, yes, the CPA exam is incredibly hard to pass. This is passing all 4 parts, and that might even be a good year. But now we have our answer for the people who did not take a prep course. Only 16.19% passed, 83% or 84% did not. But look at this. Here's the people who took the prep course. Only 39.22% passed, almost 61%. Even though they took the prep course, did not pass. Oops, I almost forgot. Column labels, not a good label in our report. Design, layout, report layout, show in tabular. In fact, I better come back over to this one. Oops, design, report layout, show in tabular. All right, so yes, the CPA exam is hard. But what's not hard is creating pivot tables. And in this video, we saw some epic examples, including this cross-tabulated report where we did show values as percentage of row. Back over here on cell phone data, we saw the incredibly common single column with text. And all we want to do is get a unique list, count, and get percentages. Then over on sales data, we actually did VLOOKUP for country and product category, added these 2 columns to our data set, and then created pivot tables and used these fields. Over on PT1, here's our first pivot table, product category and country in the row, and calculated average revenue. Then created a slicer, which of course filters the entire report. We connected the slicer to both reports. This report was product with sum of revenue, average of revenue, and please count the transactions, the times we had a particular product. Then over on PT2, we saw the amazing group by feature in pivot tables, perhaps one of the most beloved features in a pivot table. We group by years and month, calculated total revenue, then saw show values as to calculate change month by month, percentage change, and even running total. Now, if you like that video, be sure to click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and sub, because there's always lots more videos to come from Excel is Fun, including the next couple of Excel basics. We'll see a couple of short, cool pivot table tricks. All right, we'll see you next video.